I came out for this weekend conference that was held at the University of California at Berkeley. In those days we called it Berkeley. And here were 2,000 people talking about the one subject that no one in this culture wanted to ever talk about. And they were all smiling and looked happy. And I thought, boy, that's really strange. And then I found out that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was going to do a 5-day training immediately following this weekend conference. So I signed up for it. I called my father back in New Jersey and I said, I won't be home for another week. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm taking a training on working with people who are dying. And he said, what? With who? Who's teaching this? I said, a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He said, who's she? I said, she's a psychiatrist from Switzerland. He said, well, don't you know that all psychiatrists are insane? What are you doing? So that was sort of how it started. Now, I came home from that week with Elizabeth, realizing that I had learned more about relationship than I had about anything else. And what I learned was it really took place in an experience that I wrote about in the introduction to Awakening from Grief, which was a workshop during that week that was led by a man named Charles Garfield. Does anyone know Charles Garfield? Charlie Garfield is a wonderful psychologist who teaches at the University of California Medical School. And he started something called the Shanti Project back in the 1970s, which was sort of like one of the first hospice groups, or drawing in people who wanted to volunteer to help people who were dying and their families, people who were grieving. It was all volunteer. And so Charlie led us through an experience during that week during which we sat with our eyes closed. It was guided visualization, and he led us through the experience of our own death, which ultimately resulted in looking at your own feelings about leaving those you love behind. And then sort of reversing roles and looking at their feelings. Like, what are the people who are going to lose you feeling? It was an interesting situation because when he did that, I was 26 years old at the time, and I started sobbing. And I couldn't stop, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And I realized when I finally got through that I hadn't cried in 12 years, since I was 14. And what it made me realize was the incredible importance of relationships and how we often go through life on autopilot with a kind of a thinking that I'll get around to being loving later. We'll fix this relationship later. I'll be kind later. And this is especially true when we're younger. I'll learn to be generous later, but right now I'm making money or doing whatever I'm doing. And after 35 years of doing this work, I've really come to understand that we don't always have later. For instance, I live in New Jersey, just 15 miles outside New York City. And on 9/11/2001, there were 3,000 families in the immediate area who said, but I was expecting him or her home for dinner tonight. And I remember working with a woman who became a good friend of ours who said, when my husband said goodbye this morning, I didn't even lift my head off the pillow. Now, I've had what turns out to be the great blessing of realizing the uncertain nature of life for so many years now that, and I was telling the story last night, I've worked for many years with a couple named Stephen and Andrea Levine. How many people know Stephen and Andrea? Beautiful, extraordinary human beings. And Stephen and Andrea, who also did this work, Stephen was in the same workshop I was in Berkeley back in 1976. Began training with Elizabeth. And their vow, one of their vows in their marriage, was a very interesting one. They made a vow to each other to never leave the house angry. Not to say that they would never get angry with each other, but that they wouldn't storm out the door or leave or say, I've got an appointment, we've got to deal with this later. Because we've all dealt with far too many people whose last interaction with someone they love was an interaction in anger. And then that person suddenly died. And that's a very tricky grief to deal with. Not saying, it can be dealt with. But there are certain things in life that we would do well not to further complicate our experience as human beings. And that's one of them. So the deal was that if they were in a moment of anger, that they would, if they needed to, they'd go to opposite ends of the house. If there was some appointment that had to wait, it just had to wait, because neither one of them was going to go out and get in the car or walk out in the woods or whatever. They're going to stay in the house until they could part in a space of love. That I've never worked with somebody who on their deathbed was sorry that they didn't make more money. Or there's that famous cliche, I've never encountered anybody who wished they'd spent more time at the office. What do people wish? They wish that they'd spent more time with their children, with their wives and husbands, had focused on their families more, had been more kind and more generous. This is a very special evening for me tonight. I want to share with you that one of my dearest cousins is here, Peter Zales, who's in the third row there. I hope you don't mind me introducing you.
Hi, Peter.
And his wife, Pat, and their dear friend, Sylvia, sitting between them. And when I thought of Peter coming tonight, we grew up almost together. He's a little bit younger than me. So, but we had an interesting relationship in our family because Peter was a Marine in the 1950s, and I was a hippie weirdo in the 1960s. And he was the one the family was always proud of, and I was the one the family was always embarrassed about. But Peter was always incredibly kind to me. And I've never forgotten it. When I was going through difficulties when I was a teenager, I remember a few specific times when he reached out his hand in friendship or tried to spend time with me. And I just feel so grateful about that. It's wonderful to be able to acknowledge that here this evening. That, and those kinds of things, the little kindnesses that people show us. I got an invitation about a year ago to write a story for a book by Donna Markova. It's a wonderful book. I think it's called Spots of Grace. And the idea was that she wanted people to write stories about just a quick moment in life when your mood was lifted by an interaction with some other human being. And the question, as she posed it, caused me to remember this moment. I remember the year, it was 1982. And I was walking down West 57th Street in New York City. And I was going through a hard time. My father was dying, and it was a difficult time. And I'm walking down the street, and this woman coming the other way made eye contact with me. And she had this huge smile on her face. And and I looked at her, and she looked at me. Now, this is in itself unusual in New York City. And I realized that in that moment, just a smile from a stranger completely changed my mood and completely changed my day.